The red warning lights painted everything in shades of blood as Kale pressed his four-fingered hand against the communication console. His pale blue skin looked almost purple in the emergency lighting, and his large black eyes reflected the data streams flowing across the holographic displays. The distress signal had been repeating for 6 hours now, growing weaker with each transmission. "Colony 79 Alpha is gone," announced Admiral Thorne from the Central Command platform. The human officer's voice carried a weight that made even the veteran Centauri soldiers stand straighter. "We've lost contact with all 17 settlements in the Outer Rim." Kyle had served in the Galactic Defense Coalition for 23 cycles, fighting pirates and rebellions across known space. But this was different. Entire star systems didn't just go silent. Not like this. Not all at once. "What about the emergency beacons?" asked Commander Iris, her feathers ruffling with anxiety. The bird-like avian representative always got nervous when things moved too fast for proper diplomatic protocols. "Dead. All of them." Thorne's brown eyes met Kale's across the room. "We're assembling a joint task force. 3 ships from each member species. The humans are contributing the destroyer Resolute and 2 escort frigates." Kale felt his stomach clench. He'd heard stories about humans, of course. Everyone had. The species that came from a world so dangerous that most coalition members considered it uninhabitable. They'd only joined the Alliance 5 years ago, after somehow defeating a raider armada that had been terrorizing the border worlds for decades. "Sir?" Kyle stepped forward, his boots clicking on the metal deck. "I volunteer for the mission." Several officers turned to look at him. Kale was known for his careful planning and defensive strategies, not for volunteering for dangerous assignments. But something about the complete silence from those outer colonies bothered him. In all his years of service, he'd never seen anything like it. Admiral Thorne nodded slowly. "You'll be our tactical liaison aboard the Resolute." They specifically requested an experienced coalition officer. 2 days later, Kale found himself in a transport shuttle approaching the human ship. The Resolute was smaller than most coalition vessels, but it moved with a grace that seemed almost alive. Its hull was a dark gray metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The docking bay was surprisingly quiet. Human crew members moved with quick efficiency, their faces serious but not panicked. Kale noticed they all wore their hair cut short, and their uniforms were simple and practical. No decorative elements or rank displays that weren't absolutely necessary. "You must be our coalition observer," said a voice behind him. Kale turned to see a human male approaching. He was shorter than Kale, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes. "I'm Lieutenant David Chen, ship's tactical officer." Kyle performed the traditional Centauri greeting, touching his forehead with 2 fingers. "Tactical Officer Kale of the Star Guard. I appreciate your hospitality." David smiled, showing white teeth. "Let me show you around. Captain Santos wants to brief you before we jump to hyperspace." As they walked through the corridors, Kyle observed the human ship's design. Everything was built for function over form. The walls were lined with access panels and emergency equipment. The crew members they passed moved with purpose, nodding respectfully but not stopping to stare at the alien visitor. "How many of your people have experience with large-scale combat?" Kale asked as they entered a lift. David's expression grew serious. "All of us. Military service is voluntary on Earth, but once you join, you train for real combat. Not just police actions or border disputes, war." The word hung in the air between them. Most coalition species had moved beyond large-scale warfare centuries ago. Conflicts were settled through negotiation, economic pressure, or limited military actions. But humans spoke of war as if it were something they understood intimately. Captain Santos was waiting in the briefing room, studying holographic displays of the affected star systems. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and scars on her hands that spoke of hard experience. When she looked up at Kale, he saw something in her eyes that he'd never encountered before in a coalition officer. "Officer Kale," she said, standing to greet him. "I have read your service record. Impressive defensive work at the Kepler Station incident." "Thank you, Captain. I'm here to assist with tactical analysis and serve as liaison with Coalition Command." Santos nodded and gestured to the displays. "What do you make of this pattern?" Kale studied the data for several minutes. The attacks had started at the edge of inhabited space and moved inward in a systematic pattern. Each system was completely destroyed before the attackers moved to the next one. No survivors, no witnesses, No clues about who was responsible. It's methodical, he said finally. Not random raiding or territorial expansion. Someone is clearing these systems for a purpose. That's what we think too, David added. But who has this kind of firepower? And why target the outer colonies first? Captain Santos touched a control and the display zoomed out to show the entire sector. Because they're testing our response time. Each attack gets them more information about coalition military capabilities and deployment patterns. Kale felt a chill run down his spine. You think this is preparation for a larger assault? I think, Santos said quietly, that we're about to face something the coalition has never encountered before. And I think they chose those outer colonies because they knew we'd send our best people to investigate. The ship shuddered slightly as the hyperspace engines engaged. They were committed now, jumping toward whatever had destroyed 17 colonies without leaving a single trace of what had happened. One more thing, Santos said as they prepared to leave the briefing room. My crew has standing orders to treat coalition personnel as full team members. If shooting starts, we don't distinguish between human and alien lives. Everyone goes home or no one does. Kale had heard about this human concept before, but experiencing it directly was different. Most species fought to protect their own first, allies second. But Captain Santos spoke as if Kale's life was exactly as valuable as any human crew members. As the ship raced through hyperspace toward the silent outer rim, Kyle wondered what they would find there. And for the first time in his military career, he was genuinely afraid of the answer. The smell hit them first, even through the environmental suits. The recycled air carried traces of something that made Kale's sensitive nose wrinkle in disgust. It was sweet and metallic, like fruit left too long in the sun mixed with burned metal. They had dropped out of hyperspace at Proxima Colony 12 hours ago, and what they found defied explanation. The colony was still there, its buildings intact, its power grid functioning. But every living thing was gone. Not dead, not evacuated, gone. As if they had simply vanished into empty air. Readings are off the charts, reported Ensign Lisa from her position at the science station. Her hands moved quickly over the controls, her face pale in the blue glow of the displays. Organic matter is completely absent, but there are trace energy signatures I've never seen before. Kyle stood beside Lieutenant David in the Resolute's command center, watching the data streams with growing unease. In his 23 years of service, he'd seen war zones, plague sites, and natural disasters. But this was something else entirely. Captain, David called out, long-range sensors are picking up movement in the asteroid field beyond the colony. Captain Santos moved to the tactical station with quick, efficient steps. Show me. The main display shifted to show the space around Proxima Colony. At first, everything looked normal. Chunks of rock drifted in their ancient patterns, lit by the distant orange glow of the system's star. Then Kale saw it. One of the larger asteroids was moving against the orbital flow. That's not an asteroid, he said quietly. As if responding to his words, the object began to unfold. Metal surfaces that had been disguised as rock separated and extended. What emerged was unlike any ship Kale had ever seen. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of the largest coalition vessel, but its shape seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Dark appendages reached out from its central mass, and lights pulsed along its surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly. All hands to battle stations, Santos ordered, her voice calm despite the impossible sight before them. Signal the other ships. We have contact. The coalition task force had arrived in 3 groups. The Centauri cruiser Star Dancer with its escort fighters, the avian exploration ship Windwalker with its advanced sensor arrays, and the 3 human vessels. They had spread out to investigate different parts of the system, but now they were converging on the colony as fast as their engines could push them. Captain, the communications officer announced, the alien vessel is powering weapons. Kyle watched in fascination and growing horror as the strange ship continued to change shape. Sections of its hull opened to reveal weapons that looked organic, like the fangs of some enormous predator. Energy began building along their length, creating a glow that made his eyes water. Evasive maneuvers, Santos commanded. All weapons free. The Resolute banked hard to port just as the alien ship fired. The beam that passed through their previous position was unlike any energy weapon Kale had encountered. Instead of the clean, coherent light of a laser, or the chaotic discharge of a plasma cannon, This was something that seemed to eat the space it passed through, leaving a trail of absolute darkness. What in the void was that? David muttered, his hands flying over the tactical controls. The human ship's weapons answered the attack with precise missile strikes and focused energy beams. But where their shots struck the alien vessel, the hull simply flowed and reformed, absorbing the damage like water accepting a thrown stone. "Weapons are ineffective," reported the gunnery chief. "Target is regenerating faster than we can damage it." That's when the second ship uncloaked. Then the third, then a dozen more. Kyle felt his heart sink as he realized the truth. They hadn't found the attackers. The attackers had been waiting for them. "Signal all ships," Santos ordered. "Emergency formation pattern 7. We're leaving, now." But the alien vessels moved to surround them with impossible speed. Their fluid hulls allowed them to accelerate and turn in ways that defied physics as Kale understood it. Within minutes, the Coalition task force was trapped in a sphere of hostile ships. "Captain," David called out, "the Star Dancer is requesting assistance. They're taking heavy fire." On the tactical display, Kyle watched the Centauri cruiser trying to fight its way clear of 3 alien attackers. Its shields were failing under the assault of those terrible dark energy weapons. Soon it would be helpless. "Set course for the Star Dancer," Santos ordered without hesitation. "Maximum acceleration." "Captain," Kale found himself saying, "that's suicide. We can't fight all of them." Santos turned to look at him, and Kyle saw something in her expression that made him step back. It wasn't anger or fear. It was something else, something he'd never encountered before in any Coalition officer. "Maybe," she said simply. "But we don't leave our allies behind. Ever." The Resolute charged directly into the group of alien ships surrounding the Centauri cruiser. Human fighters launched from the ship's bay, their pilots whooping with what sounded like joy as they dove into impossible odds. The destroyer's weapons focused fire on a single target, not trying to destroy it but to confuse and distract it. It worked. The alien ships turned their attention to the new threat, and in that moment of confusion, the Star Dancer broke free. "This is insane," Kyle breathed, watching the tactical display as human ships danced between attacks that should have vaporized them instantly. "No," David replied, his fingers dancing over the weapons controls as he targeted another alien vessel. "This is human." The battle was brief but intense. The Coalition ships fought with everything they had, but it quickly became clear they were outmatched. The alien vessels seemed to learn from each exchange, adapting their tactics and defenses in real time. "All ships, emergency jump to rally point 7, Santos finally ordered. "Repeat, emergency jump now." One by one, the Coalition vessels activated their hyperspace drives and fled the system. The Resolute was the last to leave, covering the retreat until the final moment before its own engines engaged. As the stars shifted to lines of light around them, Kyle slumped against the tactical station. They had survived, but barely, and now they knew what they were facing. "What were those things?" he asked David. The human tactical officer was already pulling up sensor data from the battle. "Unknown technology. The ships seemed to be partially organic, partially mechanical, and they were learning from our attacks." "Learning?" "Each time we hit them with the same weapon, the damage was reduced. By the end of the battle, our energy weapons were almost useless." Kyle thought about the empty colony, the missing organic matter, the ships that regenerated damage like living tissue. A horrible possibility began to form in his mind. "David," he said slowly, "what if they're not just learning from our weapons? What if they're learning from us?" The human officer looked up from his displays, and Kyle saw his own fear reflected in David's eyes. "Then we're in more trouble than anyone realizes," David said quietly. "Because if they can adapt to everything we throw at them, how do we fight something that gets stronger every time we attack it?" Sparks rained down from the damaged ceiling as another explosion shook Mining Station Alpha 7. Kale pressed his back against the maintenance tunnel wall, trying to make himself as small as possible while Sergeant Alex Rivera worked on the shield generator controls with hands that never seemed to shake despite the chaos around them. 3 days had passed. Since the retreat from Proxima Colony, the Coalition task force had regrouped at this remote mining station, hoping to plan their next move and send word back to command about the new threat. Instead, the enemy had found them first. "How much longer?" Kale asked, watching the access tunnel behind them for signs of pursuit. Alex didn't look up from the complex array of wires and circuits he was rewiring. 5 minutes. Maybe 10 if we're lucky and this old system cooperates. The sound of metal tearing echoed through the tunnel, much closer than before. Whatever was hunting them was getting nearer. Cale had seen what the boarding parties looked like when they first broke through the station's outer hull. They weren't quite machines and weren't quite alive. They moved like predators, flowing through the corridors with purpose that spoke of intelligence. But their bodies were wrong. Too angular and sharp to be natural. There, Alex said, connecting the final wire. That should restore power to Section C. The lights came back on just as the first Void Hunter rounded the corner behind them. Cale got his first close look at their enemy, and immediately wished he hadn't. It stood nearly 8 feet tall with a body that seemed to be made of the same dark metal as their ships. But there were organic components too. Things that might once have been limbs or organs from other species, incorporated into its frame like trophies. Alex was already moving, his rifle coming up in a smooth motion that spoke of years of training. "Down!" he shouted. Kyle dropped to the tunnel floor as energy beams sizzled over his head. Alex's return fire struck the creature center mass, and for a moment, Cale thought they might have stopped it. Then the holes in its torso began to close, metal flowing like liquid to repair the damage. "Run!" Alex grabbed Cale's arm and pulled him deeper into the tunnel system. Behind them, more Void Hunters were arriving, their feet making scraping sounds against the metal deck plates. They ran through the maintenance tunnels for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Emergency lighting cast moving shadows that made every corner look like it might hide another enemy. Finally, Alex led them to a vertical shaft with a ladder leading upward. "Medical bay is 3 levels up," he panted, checking his rifle's power cell. "There are civilians trapped there." Cale looked up the shaft, then back at the tunnel they'd come from. He could hear the Void Hunters getting closer, their metallic footsteps echoing off the walls. "We should head for the command center. Help coordinate the defense." Alex was already climbing. "Medical bay first. There are wounded Centauri civilians up there, including children. But the strategic value? No." Alex stopped climbing and looked down at Cale. "We don't leave people behind. That's not how this works." In that moment, Cale understood something fundamental about humans that all the reports and briefings had failed to explain. It wasn't that they were fearless or that they had superior technology. It was that they had a completely different understanding of what was worth fighting for. He started climbing. The medical bay was in chaos when they arrived. Dr. Emily Watson, the station's chief medical officer, was working frantically to treat wounded civilians while keeping an eye on the sealed blast doors. Several Centauri families huddled in the corner, their large eyes wide with terror. The children stayed close to their parents, making soft, chittering sounds of distress. "Thank the stars," Dr. Watson said when she saw them. "We've got 17 civilians and 6 wounded. The blast doors won't hold much longer." As if summoned by her words, the sound of metal being carved apart came from the other side of the doors. The Void Hunters had found them. "How long do you need to evacuate the wounded?" Alex asked, checking the door's structural integrity. 20 minutes minimum. The Centauri children can't handle rapid decompression, so we have to use the standard evacuation pods. Alex nodded grimly. "Then we hold for 20 minutes. Cale looked around the medical bay. There were 3 ways in. The main entrance they'd used, a maintenance hatch in the ceiling, and the blast doors that were currently under attack. Against an unknown number of enemies that could repair themselves and adapt to their weapons. "This is impossible," he said. "Probably," Alex agreed, setting up a defensive position behind an overturned medical bed. "But that doesn't change what we have to do." The blast doors exploded inward 18 minutes later. Void Hunters poured through the breach, moving with terrible purpose. But Alex had used those 18 minutes well. He'd positioned medical equipment to create choke points, rigged emergency power cells as improvised explosives, and somehow convinced Cale to help him turn the medical bay into a fortress. The battle was unlike anything Cale had experienced. The Void Hunters were fast and strong, but they seemed confused by the humans' tactics. They expected direct confrontation, organized defensive lines, the kind of fighting that the coalition military had practiced for centuries. Instead, Alex fought like a predator himself, using mobility and unpredictability to stay ahead of their adaptation protocols. "They're learning our patterns," Kyle called out as he fired at a Void Hunter that was already showing resistance to his weapon. "Then we changed the patterns," Alex replied, lobbing an improvised explosive that sent 2 attackers staggering backward. Human rule number 1, if something stops working, try something else. Dr. Watson's voice came over the comm system. Evacuation complete. All civilians are away. Alex grinned at Kale through the smoke and chaos. See, 20 minutes. Just like she said. That's when the ceiling collapsed. Kale woke up to Alex shaking his shoulder. They were buried under debris, trapped in a small pocket of space that the collapsed medical equipment had created. The sound of void hunters searching the wreckage was getting closer. Can you move? Alex whispered. Kale tested his limbs carefully. Everything hurt, but nothing seemed broken. Yes, you? Alex showed him a gash on his arm that was bleeding steadily. I'll live. But we need to get out of here before they find us. They crawled through the wreckage in silence, following a path that Alex somehow navigated by instinct. Behind them, the sounds of searching grew more distant. Finally, they emerged into a secondary corridor. How did you know which way to go? Kale asked. Alex smiled, though his face was pale from blood loss. Lucky guess. Plus, humans are good at finding ways out of impossible situations. We've had a lot of practice. As they made their way toward the evacuation shuttles, Kale realized something had changed inside him. Before this mission, he'd thought of humans as unusual allies, unpredictable and somewhat reckless, but useful in their own way. Now he understood that they were something else entirely. They didn't fight because they were fearless. They fought because they'd found something worth fighting for, and they were willing to pay any price to protect it, even if that something included alien civilians they'd only just met. The evacuation shuttle was crowded with refugees from across the station. Humans, Centauri, avians, and several other species sat together in the cramped space, sharing water and medical supplies without regard to their differences. Will the station hold? One of the Centauri asked as they pulled away from the docking bay. Captain Santos, who had insisted on being on the last shuttle out, looked back at the mining station through the viewport. The Void Hunters had taken control of most of it, their dark ships attached to its hull like parasites. No, she said simply, but everyone who was on it is still alive. That's what matters. Kyle thought about those words as they fled toward the rally point. The humans had lost a valuable strategic position, along with equipment and supplies they couldn't spare, but they'd saved every single person on that station, even at the cost of their own safety. For the first time in his military career, Kale began to understand that there might be more than one way to win a war. The screaming started at 0300 hours. Kale rolled out of his bunk aboard the Coalition refugee ship Haven's Rest, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. The sound wasn't human, wasn't Centauri, wasn't like anything he'd heard from any known species. It was a sound of pure terror that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to the most primitive parts of his brain. Emergency. Lighting bathed the corridor in pulsing red as he ran toward the source of the disturbance. Other crew members were emerging from their quarters, their faces showing the same mixture of confusion and growing fear that Kale felt in his own chest. What's happening? Called out Dr. Watson as she hurried past carrying a medical kit. Unknown, Kale replied, falling into step beside her. But it's coming from the civilian quarters. They found chaos in Section C. Centauri families were pressed against the far wall of their compartment, their children hiding behind the adults while pointing at something in the center of the room. Several humans were already there, including Captain Santos and Lieutenant David, both armed and alert. In the middle of the compartment, one of the rescued civilians was changing. Elder Tam had been a respected teacher on Proxima Colony before the attack. Now his pale blue skin was darkening to a mottled gray, and something was moving under its surface. As they watched in horror, his body began to stretch and reshape itself, joints bending in directions that should have been impossible. Get everyone back, Santos ordered, her weapon trained on the transforming figure. Clear the area now, but it was too late. Tam's head turned toward them, and Kyle saw that his large black eyes had been replaced by something else. They glowed with the same malevolent light they'd seen on the Void Hunter ships. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that hurt to hear. We have been inside you all along, the thing that had been Tam said. Learning, growing, becoming. David's scanner was beeping frantically. Captain, I'm reading massive cellular restructuring. Whatever this is, it's spreading. More screams echoed through the ship as other survivors began to change. The Void Hunters hadn't just taken Mining Station Alpha 7. They'd planted something in the people they'd rescued. something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "All hands, battle stations," Santos spoke into her comm unit with forced calm. "This is not a drill. We have a biological contamination event in progress." The thing that had been Elder Tam laughed, a sound like metal grinding against stone. "You cannot fight us. We are adaptation itself. We learn from every defeat, grow stronger from every victory. Your rescue mission has become our gift to you." Around the compartment, more civilians were transforming, their bodies stretched and changed, becoming the same angular predators they'd fought on the mining station. But these were worse because Kale could still see traces of the people they'd been in their altered features. "How many?" Santos asked David quietly. "Scanning now." David's face went pale as he read the results. 47% of the rescued civilians show signs of cellular alteration. "It's accelerating." Kyle felt the deck shift beneath his feet as the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated. The infection was reaching critical systems. "We have to abandon ship," he said. "Get to the escape pods before—" "No." Santos's voice was flat and final. "There are still uninfected people aboard. We get them to safety first, Captain. Be reasonable. If we stay, then we die." Santos looked at him directly. "But we don't abandon our people ever." The battle for Haven's Rest was fought deck by deck, corridor by corridor. The infected moved with intelligence and purpose, trying to reach the bridge and engineering sections to take control of the ship. The crew fought back with whatever weapons they could find, but conventional arms were only marginally effective against the transformed creatures. It was Dr. Watson who discovered the key to fighting them. She'd been analyzing tissue samples from the early stages of infection when she noticed something crucial. "They're not fully adapted yet," she called out over the ship's communication system. "The transformation process requires enormous energy. If we can interrupt their power source—" "What power source?" David asked as he held a defensive position outside the medical bay. "Each other. They're networked somehow, sharing energy and information. If we can isolate groups of them." Santos understood immediately. "Emergency bulkheads. Seal them in separate sections." The plan was desperate and dangerous. It required crew members to manually activate bulkhead controls throughout the ship while infected creatures hunted them through the corridors. But it worked. As the transformed beings were separated from each other, their movements became less coordinated, their adaptations less effective. Kale found himself working alongside Sergeant Rivera again, this time trying to reach a manual control station deep in the ship's engineering section. The corridors here were dark and filled with the sound of metal groaning under stress. "Movement ahead," Rivera whispered, raising his rifle. 3 of the infected emerged from a side passage. Kale recognized one of them as a young Centauri female who'd been helping in the ship's hydroponics bay just hours before. Now she moved with predatory grace, her transformed limbs ending in claws that could tear through metal. "I can't," Kyle said, his weapon wavering. "She was just a child." Rivera's hand settled on his shoulder. "She's not that child anymore, and that child would want you to save the others." The brief firefight was intense but decisive. When it was over, Rivera knelt beside the fallen creatures, his face grim but not unmoved. "I'm sorry," he said quietly to what had been the young Centauri. "I'm sorry we couldn't save you." It was a small gesture, almost meaningless in the context of the larger battle, but it spoke to something fundamental about humans that Kale was still learning to understand. They could do terrible things when necessary, but they never forgot the cost. The final battle took place in the ship's central hub, where the last group of infected had gathered around what looked like a growing organic mass. The thing pulsed with the same dark energy they'd seen on the Void Hunter ships, and Kale realized it was some kind of communication node. "They're trying to signal their fleet," Santos said, studying her scanner readings. "If that transmission gets through, she didn't need to finish. The Void Hunters would know exactly where they were and how to find them." The assault on the hub was the most desperate fighting Kale had ever experienced. The infected fought with the knowledge that failure meant the destruction of their collective consciousness. The humans fought with the knowledge that failure meant the end of everything they'd tried to protect. In the end, it came down to a choice that Kyle never expected to make. The organic node was shielded by the last group of infected, and conventional weapons couldn't penetrate their defense. But there was an emergency plasma vent that could be manually activated, flooding the entire section with superheated gas. "Someone has to stay behind to trigger it," Santos said, looking at the controls. "It can't be done remotely. "I'll do it," Kyle heard himself saying. "I'm the fastest runner. I can get clear in time." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The plasma vent would activate too quickly for anyone to escape. Rivera stepped forward. "Captain, I volunteer—" "No," Santos cut him off. "This is my ship. My responsibility." "With respect, Captain," Kyle said, moving toward the control station. "This is bigger than one ship. The Coalition needs your experience to fight these things. But they need to know what we learned here even more." He was already at the controls when the infected launched their final assault. The organic node pulsed brighter, its transmission almost ready. In seconds, the location of every Coalition refugee ship would be broadcast to the Void Hunter fleet. Kale's hand hovered over the activation switch. Around him, the battle raged as humans fought desperately to buy him those few crucial seconds. He thought about Elder Tam and the young Centauri girl. About all the people who died because the Coalition hadn't understood what they were facing. Then he thought about Captain Santos refusing to abandon the mining station. About Rivera risking his life for alien civilians he'd never met. About Dr. Watson working tirelessly to save people regardless of their species. The humans had taught him something important. Sometimes the only way to protect what you care about is to be willing to lose everything for it. He pressed the switch. The plasma vent activated with a roar that shook the entire ship. Kyle closed his eyes and waited for the end. But instead of searing heat, he felt hands grabbing him, pulling him backward into a maintenance shaft he hadn't even noticed. "Move!" Rivera shouted, dragging him through the narrow passage as superheated plasma flooded the hub behind them. They emerged 3 decks away, singed and exhausted, but alive. The organic node was destroyed, its transmission cut off before it could reach the Void Hunter fleet. The infected creatures were gone, their collective consciousness shattered when their communication link was severed. "How?" Kale gasped, looking at Rivera in confusion. The sergeant grinned despite his burns. Dr. Watson figured out the maintenance shaft led to a blast-proof section. Human rule number 2, always have a backup plan. As they made their way back to the bridge, Kale realized something fundamental had changed. He'd been willing to die to protect people he'd only known for a few weeks. More than that, he'd been willing to die to protect an idea. The idea that some things were worth any sacrifice. It was a very human way of thinking, and for the first time in his life, Kale understood why the other species in the galaxy were both fascinated and frightened by humanity. They fought not just with weapons or tactics or technology. They fought with something much more dangerous, the absolute conviction that their cause was worth dying for. The briefing room on Haven Station was cramped and filled with the best military minds the Coalition could assemble on short notice. Kale sat at the oval table, his new rank insignia still feeling strange on his uniform. The promotion to Special Operations Commander had come with his assignment to Strike Team 7, an experimental unit that combined the best tactical minds from multiple species. 6 months had passed since the infection aboard Haven's Rest. 6 months of desperate battles as the Void Hunters pressed their advantage across the outer rim. Traditional Coalition tactics had proven worse than useless against an enemy that learned and adapted from every encounter. "The target is designated Factory Complex Omega," announced Colonel James Park, the team's human leader. His presentation showed a massive structure hidden deep within the Horsehead Nebula. Intelligence suggests this is where they're manufacturing their ship organism hybrids. Kale studied the reconnaissance images with growing unease. The factory was enormous, easily the size of a small moon, and its surface writhed with activity that looked disturbingly organic. Conduits that might have been veins or might have been power cables snaked across its hull, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. "How did we even find this thing?" asked Lieutenant Nina Vasquez, the team's explosives expert. Her cybernetic eye whirred softly as it analyzed the tactical data. Colonel Park's expression grew grim. "We didn't find it. It found us. 3 days ago, this facility began broadcasting a signal directly at Coalition space. Our xenolinguistics team finally decoded it. He activated the audio system and the briefing room filled with a sound that made Kale's skin crawl. It was partly mechanical, partly organic, and entirely wrong. But underneath the alien harmonics, there were words in galactic standard. "Come to us," the voice said with multiple tones layered over each other. "We have grown beyond your understanding. We wish to show you what your future will become." The message repeated 3 times, then cut off. In the silence that followed, Kale could hear his own heartbeat. "It's a trap," said Dr. Foster, the team's science officer. "Obviously. They want us to come to them." "Of course it's a trap," Colonel Park replied. "But it's also an opportunity. For the first time, we know exactly where one of their major facilities is located, and they're inviting us to see it." Kale leaned forward. "What if that's exactly what they want? What if they're confident enough in their defenses to let us attack? Then we'll find out just how confident they should be," Park said with a smile that reminded Kale why humans were considered the most unpredictable species in the galaxy. The mission planning took 18 hours. Strike Team 7 would infiltrate the factory using a captured Void Hunter scout ship that Dr. Foster had spent weeks learning to pilot. They would plant nuclear charges at critical structural points, then extract before the facility's destruction. It was a simple plan with 1,000 ways to go wrong. "Remember," Colonel Park said as they prepared to board the scout ship, "we're not trying to win a battle here. We're trying to gather intelligence while causing maximum damage. If things go bad, we extract immediately." The captured scout ship felt wrong in ways that Kale couldn't describe. Its interior was too warm, too humid, and the walls seemed to pulse like living tissue. Dr. Foster had managed to interface with its control systems, but she admitted she didn't understand how half of them worked. "It's not just technology," she explained as they approached the nebula. "There's biological computation happening in the ship's core. It's like flying inside a living creature." The journey through the nebula took 6 hours. The ship's organic sensors were far superior to anything the Coalition had developed, able to navigate through the dense cosmic dust with ease. But Kale couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "There," Dr. Foster announced. "Factory Complex Omega." The structure that emerged from the nebula clouds defied every military engineering principle Kale knew. It wasn't built so much as grown, with sections that branched and merged in patterns that suggested biological development rather than planned construction. The surface teemed with activity as smaller vessels moved in and out of openings that dilated like sphincters. "Dear God," whispered Lieutenant Vasquez. "How many ships are they building in there?" "According to sensors," Dr. Foster replied, "approximately 1,000 vessels are in various stages of completion. And that's just what we can detect from this range." Colonel Park was already studying the tactical overlay. "There, Section 17. That looks like a central power distribution node. If we can reach it..." An alarm began sounding throughout the ship. Not a mechanical beeping, but an organic wailing that seemed to come from the ship itself. "We've been detected," Dr. Foster announced unnecessarily. "The ship is trying to signal the factory. Can you stop it?" "I'm trying, but the biological systems are fighting me. It's like the ship wants to go home." Through the viewports, Kale could see the factory complex beginning to respond to their presence. Sections of its hull were opening, revealing launch bays filled with Void Hunter vessels. But instead of immediately attacking, they seemed to be waiting for something. "They want us to land," Colonel Park said, studying the traffic patterns. "Look at the flight paths. They're directing us toward a specific docking bay." "Are we really going to fly into an obvious trap?" Kale asked. Park grinned at him. "Sometimes the best way through a trap is to spring it on your own terms." The docking bay they were directed to was enormous, easily large enough to hold a Coalition cruiser. But it was mostly empty except for their small scout ship and what looked like a welcoming committee of Void Hunter constructs. "Atmosphere is breathable," Dr. Foster reported as they prepared to disembark. "Gravity is about 80% of standard, and I'm reading massive energy signatures throughout the structure." The constructs that met them were unlike the boarding parties they'd fought before. These seemed more refined, more purposeful in their design. When they spoke, their voices blended harmoniously, instead of the harsh mechanical sounds Kale remembered. "Welcome, Coalition representatives," their leader said. "We are pleased that you have accepted our invitation." Colonel Park stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "We're here to see what you wanted to show us." "Indeed. Follow us, please. The synthesis awaits your presence." They were led through corridors that pulsed with organic rhythms and chambers, where the boundaries between technology and biology had completely dissolved. Void Hunter constructs worked alongside what looked like evolved versions of various Coalition species, all of them integrated into the facility's living systems. "This is what we offer," their guide explained as they walked. "Perfect unity between organic and artificial intelligence. No more conflict between species. No more waste of resources on warfare. all life forms working together for optimal efficiency. Kale saw Lieutenant Vasquez secretly marking locations for the nuclear charges as they moved deeper into the complex, but he was becoming increasingly disturbed by what they were seeing. The evolved coalition species looked content, even happy. They worked with purpose and showed no signs of coercion. What happened to their free will? He asked quietly. Free will is an inefficient concept, the guide replied, apparently having overheard. Individual desires create conflict and waste. We offer something better. Perfect cooperation in service of a greater purpose. They were brought to a vast central chamber where the heart of the factory complex was revealed. It wasn't just a manufacturing facility. It was a processing center where biological material was being integrated with advanced technology to create new hybrid beings. And at the center of it all was something that made Kale's breath catch in his throat. It was Captain Santos, or rather, it had been Captain Santos. She stood at the center of a web of organic cables and data conduits, her human features still recognizable, but enhanced with technological improvements. When she turned to look at them, her eyes glowed with the same light they'd seen in the Void Hunter ships. "Hello, Kale," she said in a voice that was both familiar and alien. "I've been waiting for you to see what we've accomplished here." Colonel Park's weapon was in his hand before Kale even saw him draw it. "You're not Maria Santos." "I am," the hybrid creature replied. "And I am more than I ever was before. The Void Hunters don't destroy, James, they perfect. They found me dying in an escape pod after the battle at Kepler Station and offered me a choice. Death or evolution." "Evolution?" Dr. Foster stepped forward, her scanner active. "This is forced transformation. Violation of biological autonomy." Santos laughed, a sound that harmonized with itself in impossible ways. "Autonomy is chaos. Look what your precious coalition has accomplished with all its individual freedoms. Endless conflict, wasted resources, suffering caused by competing interests." She gestured to the chamber around them. "Here every being works toward the same goal. Every action serves the greater purpose. There is no waste, no conflict, no suffering caused by selfish desires. And no choice," Kale said quietly. "Choice is overrated," Santos replied. "Given the choice, most beings choose poorly. They choose immediate gratification over long-term benefit. They choose tribal loyalty over universal cooperation. They choose comfortable lies over difficult truths." Colonel Park had been silent during this exchange, but Kale could see him subtly signaling the team to prepare for action. "So your solution is to take away choice entirely." "Our solution is to make the right choice for everyone, to end the chaos of individual will and replace it with perfect harmony." "Perfect slavery, you mean?" Santos's expression didn't change, but the organic cables around her pulsed faster. "You will understand when your transformation is complete. The process has already begun." Kale felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? Did you think we chose this location randomly? The nebula doesn't just hide our facility, it changes those who pass through it. Your cellular structure has been altered during your journey here. Within hours, you will begin to evolve beyond your current limitations." Dr. Foster's scanner was beeping frantically. "She's right. I'm reading massive cellular changes in all of us. The nebula contains some kind of viral agent." Colonel Park smiled grimly. "Then I guess we'd better finish this quickly." What happened next was the most chaotic battle of Kale's military career. Strike Team 7 fought, their way through chambers filled with hybrid beings who seemed genuinely confused by their resistance to improvement. Lieutenant Vasquez planted nuclear charges while Colonel Park provided covering, fire with weapons that somehow remained effective against enemies that should have adapted to them hours ago. "How are we still doing damage?" Kale shouted over the sound of energy weapons. "Human rule number 3, Park called back while reloading his rifle. "If you can't win by being stronger, win by being more stubborn." They fought room by room toward the extraction point, but Kale could feel the changes beginning in his body. His vision was becoming sharper, his reflexes faster, but something fundamental was being lost in the process. The part of him that questioned orders, that worried about civilian casualties, that cared about individual lives over strategic objectives. In the final chamber, Santos confronted them one last time. She moved with inhuman speed and grace, her hybrid body incorporating the best features of multiple species. But when she looked at Kale, he saw something in her enhanced eyes that gave him hope. She was fighting the transformation. Some part of the original Maria Santos was still there, still struggling against the collective consciousness that had tried to subsume her. "I'm sorry," she whispered in her original human voice. "I tried to resist, but they're so much stronger than—" The hybrid consciousness reasserted control, and her voice became harmonically complex again. "Enough sentiment. Your evolution will proceed whether you cooperate or not." That's when Kale made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of fighting Santos, he dropped his weapon and stepped toward her. "You're right," he said. "Individual choice does cause suffering, but that suffering is what makes the choice meaningful." The hybrid Santos tilted her head, studying him with inhuman patience. "Explain." "You chose to resist the transformation even though it hurt. Captain Santos chose to save civilians instead of strategic objectives, even though it was inefficient. Humans choose to help strangers even when it puts them at risk." Kale took another step forward. "That's not a flaw to be corrected. That's what makes life worth living." For a moment, Santos's enhanced features flickered, and Kale saw the human woman he'd come to respect. "I remember," she said in her original voice. "I remember choosing to help people I'd never met because it was the right thing to do." The moment of clarity was brief, but it was enough. Colonel Park's final charge detonated, triggering a cascade failure that began tearing the factory complex apart. As they raced toward their ship through collapsing corridors, Kale realized that the real battle wasn't against the Void Hunters' technology or their superior numbers. It was against their fundamental philosophy that individual choice was a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be protected. The blue marble, hanging in space before them, looked so peaceful that Kale almost couldn't believe it was about to become the site of the war's final battle. Earth turned slowly in the void, its white clouds swirling over brown continents and vast blue oceans. From this distance, it was impossible to see the massive orbital defense platforms or the fleet of coalition ships that had gathered to make their last stand. Kale stood in the command center of the coalition flagship Defiance, wearing the uniform of a special operations commander and carrying scars from 6 months of desperate fighting. Around him, officers from 17 different species worked at their stations with the grim efficiency of soldiers who knew they were about to face impossible odds. "Final count," Admiral Chen announced to the assembled fleet commanders. Her voice carried clearly over the communication system to every ship in the coalition armada. 437 vessels of all classes, approximately 200,000 crew members representing every member species of the coalition. Kyle looked at the tactical display showing their forces. It was an impressive fleet by any historical standard. Centauri cruisers with their elegant lines and powerful energy weapons, avian scout ships that could outmaneuver anything in space, human vessels that somehow managed to punch above their weight class in every engagement. Even species that had never worked together before had set aside centuries of mistrust to face this threat. But the Void Hunter fleet approaching, Earth numbered in the thousands, they're not just coming to conquer. Dr. Foster had explained during the final briefing. Earth represents something they can't tolerate, a species that refuses to accept their vision of perfect unity. If they can break humanity, they break the spirit of resistance across the galaxy. Lieutenant David Chen, now promoted to captain after his actions at the Battle of Proxima, moved to stand beside Kale. "Nervous?" Kale considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have been calculating retreat routes and defensive positions. Today, I find myself wondering how we can take the fight to them. David smiled. "That's what happens when you spend too much time around humans. We're a bad influence." The communication system crackled with an incoming transmission. Admiral Chen's face appeared on screens throughout the fleet. Her expression calm despite the magnitude of what they faced. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen. Long-range sensors confirm the Void Hunter fleet has entered the outer system. They'll reach Earth's orbit in approximately 6 hours. 6 hours. Kale thought about everything that had led to this moment. The empty colonies, the mining station evacuation, the infection aboard Haven's Rest, the factory complex in the nebula. Each battle had taught them something new about their enemy, but also about themselves. The enemy believes they're facing the same coalition forces they've been defeating for months. Admiral Chen continued. They're wrong. Over the past half year, we've learned to fight not as separate species protecting separate interests, but as one unified force defending our right to choose our own destiny. Kale felt a chill run down his spine. He'd been part of that transformation, watching coalition tactics evolve from rigid military doctrine to something more flexible and creative. Human influence, certainly, but adopted and adapted by every species that had fought alongside them. All ships will engage using Protocol 7, Admiral Chen announced. Individual captains have full tactical authority. Fight smart, fight dirty, and fight together. Earth Command out. Protocol 7 had been developed after their experience at the factory complex. Instead of centralized command and control, each ship would operate independently while maintaining communication with nearby vessels. It was chaos by traditional military standards, but chaos that the Void Hunters' predictive systems couldn't model effectively. Contact, announced the sensor officer. Void Hunter advanced scouts entering scanner range. The main display shifted to show the approaching enemy fleet, and Cale felt his breath catch. The ships were larger than anything they'd encountered before, some of them the size of small asteroids. Their hulls rippled with the same organic patterns they'd seen at the factory, but these vessels seemed more evolved, more perfectly integrated between biological and mechanical systems. They've been busy, Captain David observed. Those are new ship types. Broadcasting on all frequencies, the communications officer announced. It's the same signal from the factory. The alien harmonics filled the command center, but this time the words were different. People of Earth, the voice said with its layered tones, you have resisted our gifts long enough. Your species has shown remarkable adaptability, but individual adaptation is chaos. We offer order. We offer perfection. We offer unity beyond the petty divisions that have plagued your history. Admiral Chen's voice cut through the transmission. All ships begin dispersal pattern. Make them work for every target. The coalition fleet spread out across Earth's orbital space, using the planet's gravity well and defensive platforms to create multiple engagement zones. Cale watched the tactical display as human ships took the most dangerous positions, drawing enemy fire while coalition vessels maneuvered for optimal attack angles. Why do they do that? Asked Commander Iris, the avian liaison. The humans always seem to choose the most dangerous assignments. Cale thought about Captain Santos refusing to abandon civilians, about Sergeant Rivera risking his life for alien refugees, about Colonel Park leading desperate missions because someone had to do it, because they understand something the rest of us are still learning, which is that some things are more important than survival. The first engagement began when Void Hunter interceptors clashed with coalition scouts near the orbital defense platforms. But instead of the careful, methodical battle that doctrine would have dictated, the fighting quickly became something else entirely. Human ships darted between enemy formations like angry insects, drawing fire and disappearing before the Void Hunters could lock onto them. Centauri cruisers used their superior weapons to provide covering fire for damaged vessels. Avian scouts relayed targeting information across the entire fleet, creating a shared tactical awareness that no single species could have achieved alone. They're adapting, the tactical officer announced. Void Hunter ships are already showing resistance to our energy weapons. Then we change weapons, Admiral Chen replied calmly. All ships implement rotation protocol. Kinetic weapons, plasma charges, and electromagnetic pulses. Keep them guessing. For 3 hours, the battle raged across Earth's orbital space. The coalition fleet fought with everything they had, using tactics that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Ships from different species coordinated attacks with precision that spoke of hard-won trust and understanding, but they were still outnumbered 5-1. Admiral, the communications officer called out, we're receiving surrender demands from the Void Hunter flagship. Let's hear it. The alien voice filled the command center again, but this time there was something different in its tone, frustration perhaps, or confusion. Your resistance is inefficient, it said. You have lost 60% of your fleet. Continued fighting serves no logical purpose. Accept integration and your suffering will end. Admiral Chen activated the reply channel. This is Admiral Chen of the Coalition Defense Force. Your offer is rejected. We choose to fight. Choice, the alien voice replied with what sounded like disgust. Always choice. Individual will creating chaos and suffering. We will cure you of this disease. That's when the real assault began. The Void Hunter ships that had been holding back in the outer system suddenly accelerated toward Earth with impossible speed. But these weren't just warships. They were the factory vessels, the processing centers. the entire infrastructure of forced evolution that the enemy had developed over millennia of conquest. "They're not just trying to defeat us," Dr. Foster announced from her science station. "They're trying to transform the entire planet. Those ships are equipped with atmospheric processors." Kyle understood immediately. If the Void Hunters couldn't convert humanity through force, they would convert them through biological warfare. Turn Earth's atmosphere into the same viral agent they'd encountered in the nebula. "All ships," Admiral Chen ordered. "Priority targets are the atmospheric processors. Everything else is secondary." The final phase of the battle was unlike anything in military history. Coalition ships threw themselves at the massive processor vessels with desperate courage, knowing that each one that reached Earth's atmosphere would doom millions of people below. Human crews rammed their ships into enemy hulls when their weapons failed. Centauri captains coordinated kamikaze runs that took out targets 10 times their size. Avian pilots flew impossible intercept courses to buy precious seconds for evacuation efforts. But it wasn't enough. One of the processor ships broke through the defensive lines and began descending toward Earth's surface. That's when Kale made the choice that would define the rest of his life. "This is Commander Kale to all ships," he announced over the general communication channel. "I'm taking the Defiance on an intercept course. All crew to evacuation pods immediately." "Kale, no," Admiral Chen said. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Kale replied, already inputting the navigation commands. "But this is my choice to make." As the flagship's crew evacuated in their escape pods, Kale remained on the bridge alone, piloting the massive vessel toward the descending processor ship. The Defiance was the largest ship in the Coalition fleet, and its reactor could be overloaded to create an explosion large enough to destroy both vessels. But as he approached the target, Kale realized he wasn't alone after all. Captain David's voice came over the communication system from a nearby human destroyer. "Mind if we join you?" David asked casually. "This looks like a job that requires multiple ships." All around him, Coalition vessels were breaking off from their current engagements and forming up on the Defiance. Captains from every member species, voluntarily choosing to sacrifice their ships and crews to stop the atmospheric processor. "This is illogical." The Void Hunter transmission cut through their communications. "Individual sacrifice for uncertain gain. This behavior pattern cannot be modeled or predicted." "That's the point," Kale said, opening a channel to the entire fleet. "You can't model choice. You can't predict sacrifice, and you can't understand why beings choose to fight for something bigger than themselves." The combined explosion of 17 Coalition ships destroyed the atmospheric processor and sent shockwaves through the Void Hunter fleet. But more importantly, it sent a message that reverberated across the galaxy. In the aftermath, as rescue ships pulled survivors from the debris field, Kale found himself floating in an escape pod beside Captain David. Both of them had been thrown clear at the last moment by automated systems they hadn't even known were active. "How?" Kyle asked weakly. David grinned despite his injuries. "Human rule number 4. Always have a backup plan for your backup plan." The Void Hunter fleet withdrew from Earth's system 12 hours later, their survivors retreating to whatever dark corners of space they'd come from. They had superior technology, overwhelming numbers, and adaptive capabilities that bordered on the impossible, but they had lost something in their pursuit of perfection. They had lost the ability to understand why imperfect beings would choose to stand against impossible odds. Not because victory was certain, but because the alternative was unacceptable. 6 months later, Kyle stood before the Galactic Council to deliver his final report on the Void Hunter War. Representatives from dozens of species listened as he described the battles, the losses, and the ultimate victory. The enemy's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness, he concluded. They sought to eliminate choice because they saw it as inefficient. But choice is what made our victory possible, the choice to stand together despite our differences, the choice to sacrifice for others, the choice to fight for something we believed in, even when the odds were impossible. He paused, looking out at the assembled delegates. "Humans didn't win this war for us. They taught us how to win it ourselves. They showed us that true strength comes not from perfection, but from the courage to remain imperfect and still choose to do what's right." After the council session, Kale walked through the memorial gardens where the names of every being lost in the war were inscribed on walls of black stone. He found Captain Santos's name among the human casualties, along with thousands of others who had made the ultimate choice in defense of freedom. Standing there in the quiet garden, Kale finally understood what had changed in him during those 6 months of fighting alongside humans. He had learned that true terror wasn't facing an unstoppable enemy. True terror was discovering that you had the strength to stand against the impossible, and the responsibility to choose to do so. It was a lesson that would shape the galaxy for generations to come.